There was a house near me nicknamed the Ghost House because construction on it was never finished. It had been sitting vacant and unfinished for years. The house was on an already sketchy block, with many other properties that appeared either vacant or neglected, as overgrown grass and weeds were everywhere. One night, my friends Jenny, Luca, Kylie, and I were bored, just driving around town. We grabbed some fast food, and then Luca suggested we check out the ghost house. This time, though, he wanted to actually go inside. The girls were on board, so of course I agreed to. We parked a few houses down. The street had only one streetlight, the rest of it was dark, with many of the houses unlit, giving the block a creepy atmosphere. The neighboring houses seemed abandoned, although cars were parked in some driveways. We were careful to stay quiet as we got out of the car and walked over to the ghost house. Seeing the unfinished two-story house in the dead of night gave off eerie vibes. Next, we had to figure out a way in. We tried the front door, but it was locked. So we walked around the house, trying every window until one slid open. Jenny, being the smallest, climbed through the window and unlocked the back door for us. But it was already unlocked, meaning anyone could have just walked right in. We entered the house, which smelled like a mix of wood and some kind of rotting, almost like a cat urine smell. The first floor was more finished than I expected and had a lot of rooms, but no furniture. We all split up, each going different ways. I went upstairs to the second floor, which was less finished, with much of the wall framing exposed. I heard rustling from downstairs, just my friends being a bit too loud, so I yelled down at them. Finding nothing upstairs, I went back down and ran into Jenny. She asked about the upstairs, and I told her it was a bit unfinished. She decided to check it out anyway. I continued to look around and found the basement door under the stairs. As soon as I opened it, that rotten smell intensified. I went down the stairs, and the basement looked even more decrepit than the rest of the house. The concrete floor was stained with a rusty brownish substance, which I initially thought was paint, but the color could have matched blood. In one corner, I found a small wooden chair and a table with a Bible on it. Just then, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I whispered, "Yo, come check this out." When I got no response, I turned around but saw no one on the stairs. I asked, "Who's there then?" I noticed a woman sitting against the wall. It took me a second to realize it wasn't Jenny or Kylie. It was some random woman with long, messy hair staring right at me. Then one of the girls upstairs started screaming, and I heard Luca shouting my name, telling us to get out. I could barely muster the words, wholly before I bolted out of the basement and up the stairs. I saw my friends running out through the back door, and I followed. We didn't stop until we were back at the car. Once inside, I asked them what they'd seen because I had encountered a deranged-looking woman in the basement. Everyone was talking over each other, but one of the girls finally explained that they saw two men standing in an empty room on the first floor. They couldn't make out their faces, but they noticed dark objects on the floor before they ran. To this day, I don't know if we stumbled upon a cult gathering or just some homeless people squatting there, but you couldn't pay me to ever go back. I don't live in that town or state anymore, so I don't know what happened to that house. But based on the latest Google Maps image from 2019, it still wasn't finished. My friends and I live in a very nice area. Picture the quintessential suburban neighborhood. It's relatively quiet, and people are used to the secluded, isolated feel it provides. It's the last place you'd expect anything dangerous to happen except for what I'm about to tell you. My town radiated a calming silence that you'd eventually come to crave. This happened a few summers ago, and as much as I try to resist it, I'll never be able to erase the memory. My friend Chaz and I had always been the type of kids to try causing trouble wherever we could. Looking back, I struggled to justify our behavior. I guess it was our teenage manifestation of a rebellious spirit or something like that. We lived on the same street and hung out after school every single day. Because our neighborhood consisted of nothing but very large houses and towering trees, we didn't usually have much to do on weekdays unless we wanted to go a few towns over. So we ended up making our own fun most of the time. In our neighborhood, there was a well-known mansion at the top of a hill that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It wasn't particularly special. Every kid who lived in town had been inside at some point. The rooms were stripped of anything valuable, and it was nearly impossible to find a wall that wasn't covered in layers of graffiti. The mansion was especially creepy because it stood at the edge of a massive cemetery. For Chaz and me, this cemetery mansion became a kind of default, a plan B if we didn't have anything else to do. We'd either throw some graffiti up inside or just smoke and chill on the roof. One night was no exception. It was around 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, and Chaz and I had just been flaked on by a couple of girls we'd made plans with. Upset, we figured chucking rocks at the cemetery mansion would be a decent way to release some energy. Had we been sober, we might have been more cautious about doing something so reckless. But it was late, it was summer, and we didn't care. I convinced Chaz not to drive since we'd had more than a little to drink. After a 20-minute walk, we crested the hill and were met with the familiar yet eerie sight of vines twisting and hanging down the muddy bricks, most windows shattered, and the menacing pointed tip of the roof silhouetted against the sky. It was definitely a sinister sight, especially at such an ungodly hour. Without warning, Chaz picked up a stone and hurled it toward the house. It sailed through the air before shattering one of the fourth-floor windows. I couldn't see well in the moonlight, but the sound of shattering glass confirmed it. I gleefully picked up a rock and threw it, breaking one of the second-floor windows. Then we spotted a single, small window high up on the attic level, the highest point of the house. Chaz challenged me to hit it. I missed about 10 throws before giving up with an aggravated sigh. Chaz grinned, picked up a rock, and said, "Watch this." He aimed at the tiny target and launched it. I watched in awe as the rock flew through the air, shattering the attic window with a loud crash. I was stunned. The two of us stood there for a second, admiring his aim. Chaz was about to pick up another rock when, still looking at the shattered window, I saw a dark object fly out from the attic and sail toward us. I jumped, confused as to what I'd just seen. We looked down and realized that the rock Chaz had thrown had landed in front of us on the gravel. It was unmistakably the same rock, marked by a Z imprint on one side. We were both shaken, unsure how it was even possible. It was far too late for other kids to be doing the same thing, but that was the only explanation we could think of. We decided it must be a group of teenagers trying to mess with us, a thought that actually excited us. The devious grins on our faces told the story. We were going to try to get the jump on them before they could scare us. We crept to the front door, ducking under a thick vine hanging from the towering pillars. The door was slightly ajar, but it always was, as it had long since been misaligned from its hinges. As quietly as we could, we stepped inside, letting our eyes adjust to the minimal light and our noses to the stench of mildew and rotting wood. We slowly made our way up the creaky stairs, unable to silence the sound of the shifting wood beneath our feet. Eventually, we reached the 4th floor and stood at the base of the final staircase. Interestingly, we had never been up there before, as the entrance to the roof was on the opposite side of the house. Chaz took the lead, with me following closely behind. The staircase led to a small wooden door, which we assumed was the attic door. Chaz put his hand on the doorknob and looked back at me. I nodded, and in one swift motion, he flung the door open. Before I even saw anything, I was struck by a smell so foul I took a few steps back. It was disgusting, like death and rot, something clearly decaying in the room. Chaz covered his nose and stepped inside. Although I was more hesitant, I decided I'd rather be with him than alone on a pitch-black staircase. The sight was even worse than the smell. We found ourselves staring at a tiny room with a white pentagram painted on the floor. There were a few unlit candles and a closet door we didn't dare open. The smell seemed to be coming from the closet, and I feared Chaz might want to investigate further. But to our surprise, the room was empty. That was enough for me. I couldn't fight the urge to leave any longer. I turned toward the door, and that's when I saw them. Looking down the staircase, I saw two cloaked figures staring back up at me. I cursed and ran toward Chaz. Just then, we heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs behind us. Panicked, I braced myself to fend off whoever it was. Then Chaz yelled, "Dude, come on." I turned to see him halfway out of a shattered window, presumably stepping onto the roof. I followed his lead, and as soon as I made it onto the roof, I heard the door burst open behind us. We sprinted across the roof toward the entrance we knew about, not wanting to wait and see if we were being followed. If the situation hadn't been so dire, I might not have had the nerve to go through with the plan, as the darkness made it nearly impossible to see. One wrong step would have sent us tumbling to our deaths. I followed close behind Chaz until we reached the roof entrance, a little hatch that led to a ladder. Chaz tried to open the hatch, but it was locked from the inside. Just then, we heard a booming voice ring out from somewhere below, saying, "They went that way to this day. It's the scariest thing I've ever heard." Without thinking, I stomped on the hatch with my right foot, and it gave way with a loud crash that surely revealed our position. The impact caused me to lose my balance, and I fell into the opening, barely catching myself on the ladder. Chaz screamed at me to go, so I climbed down as quickly as I could, ignoring the pain in my leg. We sprinted down the stairs and burst out the back door, jumping the fence and running into the cemetery. Chaz seemed to be fine and was laughing, while I was so scared I could barely think. I never thought squatting behind a gravestone in a cemetery could feel so comforting. We kept a watchful eye on the mansion, half expecting someone to follow us. Just when we thought we were safe, we saw 4 or 5 cloaked figures circling the property, frantically searching under bushes and trees. We crept further into the cemetery until we were sure we couldn't be spotted in the darkness. Then, we hopped the fence and left. We haven't been back to that house since, and I can only assume we stumbled upon some kind of cult meeting or ritual. Why they chose an abandoned house for it is a question I still ask myself. It was 2017 and I was rushing a fraternity in college. Toward the end of our pledge process, our entire pledge class took a trip to an abandoned hospital in a nearby town. It was a sort of tradition that each pledge class had to go through. I carpooled with a few of my pledge brothers. There were honestly too many names to list, so I'll just mention my pledge brother, who I spent most of the night with, Joshua, a couple of others, and I carpooled to the hospital, which sat next to a large park, so we all parked in one of the park's lots. We waited until everyone arrived, then started walking down a pathway leading toward the hospital. When the path curved to the right, we had to go through a small patch of woods that separated the park from the hospital grounds. I immediately regretted wearing my white Air Force Ones and kept complaining about it. After making our way through the woods, we reached the hospital property. It was surrounded by trees and parking lots on all sides. Seeing such a tall building once full of people and lights, now standing completely dark at night, was eerie. It was my first time exploring this building, though a couple of the guys knew the secret ways in. One way involved simply climbing through one of the lower windows, which had been smashed. I followed close to the back of the group, and one by one, we climbed through this window, which led to a level below ground. The floor was wet, making me regret my shoe choice even more. Joshua and I stayed in the back, following behind the others. There were about 10 of us, so being in such a large group took away most of the fear of being in a place like this. We went up the stairs, our footsteps echoing through the building as we walked down the creepy hallways that had been abandoned for decades. Surprisingly, the walls weren't covered in graffiti. James, one of the guys who was familiar with the place, explained that not many people broke in here because few thought to cut through the park to avoid the security in front of the main parking lot. Eventually, our group started to split up a little. Some guys went one way, others went another. We were on what I think was the second floor when Joshua and I decided to go down a separate hallway. Some of the rooms looked like they hadn't been touched since the hospital closed, while others seemed like they'd been rummaged through with small amounts of graffiti here and there. Joshua and I ended up in a hospital room that still had a bed and some medical equipment. Then we saw someone walk past the doorway. We both turned and caught a glimpse of a dark shadow moving out of view. We looked at each other and I asked, "Yo, who is that?" I walked out into the hallway and at the far end saw someone standing there. I couldn't tell if they were facing me or the wall, but I could see their body. I called out, "Who is that?" The person then walked into the room next to them. Joshua joined me in the hallway, confused about what I'd seen. I told him that someone was there and suggested we go back to our group. We headed back in the opposite direction, following the faint sounds of our Pledge Brothers' voices echoing through the building. Just as we were getting closer, a blood-curdling scream, loud and piercing, erupted from the direction we had just come from. It sounded like a woman's scream, as if she were being brutally attacked. The scream was so loud that it drowned out our friends' voices. We sprinted back to the group, yelling, "Go!" Everyone immediately started running back downstairs to the lower level, where we had entered. Somehow I ended up at the back of the group again. One by one, we all crawled out through the window we'd entered from. The screaming stopped, but then we heard footsteps stomping down the stairs. They weren't the footsteps of anyone in our group. We shouted, "Go, hurry up finally." After Joshua climbed out, I did too, all the while fearing someone would grab my feet. We bolted back to the cars, racing through the woods. Once we reached the cars and caught our breath, I told everyone I had seen someone in the corridor where Joshua and I had been. That was where the screams had come from. We all left shortly afterward, freaked out. After that night, I lost any interest in urban exploration. I was taking a few days off and decided to spend them camping in the woods. I was in a forest a few hours from my town and had set up camp at the end of a 4-hour trail. I'd already spent one night there and noticed a thin path leading away from the campsite. I had no idea where it went. It wasn't on the map of the area, but having nothing better to do on that second day, I thought I'd go for a short hike down the path just to see if it led anywhere interesting, maybe a small pond or waterfall or something like that. I brought my backpack with food and water in case I'd be out longer than expected. Walking along the trail, it quickly became obvious that almost no one used it, or at least that it hadn't been used in a long time, maybe even years. It was narrow and overgrown in many sections, and I didn't see any signs of people like shoe prints or litter. This went on for several miles, taking around 2 hours before I reached the end. It wasn't what I expected. There was a house or cabin sitting in the woods. At first sight, there was no mistaking that it was abandoned. Moss and vines were growing out of the wood siding, and the doors and windows were all open. Before approaching any further, I looked around, checking my surroundings, as this wasn't the kind of thing you'd normally just stumble upon. The woods were calm and unsettlingly still. I walked up to the doorway and poked my head inside, looking down the front hallway. There was dust and debris scattered over the floors, but otherwise it was barren. I stepped in a little further. It smelled of mildew and rotting wood, but as I crept through the rooms, there wasn't much to see. Feeling uneasy, I was about to turn around and leave, but a small glimmer caught my eye. It was on one of the closed wooden doors. The handle had been ripped off and replaced by a silver padlock. It looked almost brand new and didn't match anything else in the house. My curiosity immediately made me wonder why there was a padlock on the door of an otherwise empty and ruined cabin. The more I looked at it, though, the more that uneasy feeling grew, and I couldn't bring myself to investigate. I quickly left the house and headed back to the path. Just as I entered the trail again, I heard a single footstep on the wooden floor inside the house. I turned and looked back at the doorway but saw nothing, so I kept walking, trying to put distance between myself and that place. As I walked back, though, for the entire 2 hours, I kept hearing footsteps in the distance like someone was following me. The trees densely covered the area, making it impossible to see far. When I got back to camp, I started a fire early and just sat, waiting and listening to see if anyone would show up. By nightfall, I hadn't heard anything else, but as the hours passed, I started hearing it again, footsteps in the distance, far beyond the light of the campfire, but close enough for them to see it. This went on for several hours. I'd hear a line of footsteps every 10 to 15 minutes, but still I couldn't see anyone. Eventually, it got so late that I knew I had to sleep, so I left the campfire going and got inside my tent. I was in and out of sleep for the rest of the night, waking up at every small sound the woods made. After getting almost no sleep, I left the next morning. What that cabin was doing there, and whoever had followed me that night, I'll never know. I can't say what they intended to do, but their disturbing, stalking behavior only lets me assume the worst. I still can't stop thinking about the disturbing possibilities of what was behind that locked door. This happened almost 10 years ago when I was in high school. My friend, whom I'll call Jake for privacy, and I haven't shared this story until now, mostly because we just don't know what really happened. We had been talking for a while about going to an abandoned mall near our city, but the only thing holding us back was that we didn't have a group to go with. It would just be the two of us, and we knew it was a sketchy place. For some reason, though, we were both really intrigued by the place and the idea of exploring it, so much so that we couldn't stop ourselves. We gathered some supplies in a drawstring bag and took Jake's car to get there. This mall was off the side of a long highway, but the state had blocked the view from the road with a lot of trees, probably to keep people from seeing the rundown buildings so close to the city. The road to the parking lot was destroyed, so we had to park on the side of the highway, kind of nestled around some trees so the car wouldn't be visible to passing traffic. We started walking. The sun was just beginning to set, giving us enough light not to get lost in the trees. After a few minutes, the sounds of cars passing on the highway faded out, and we reached the edge of the massive empty parking lot where the abandoned mall sat right in the middle. There were no cars, no people, and no sounds. We stood there for a moment, making sure we were alone, then walked through the parking lot to the main entrance. All the glass in the doors had been shattered, and as soon as we stepped inside, it was noticeably darker. We stayed quiet at first, walking slowly and carefully, just looking around. Being inside this huge mall with no people around and no lights on was eerie and unsettling. Every step we took echoed through the dark, empty space. As we got further toward the middle, we stopped for a moment, took our flashlights out of the bag, and then we heard someone was laughing. It came from the other end of the mall, which was pitch black. We didn't hear any talking afterward or see any lights. We both agreed it had to be another group of people exploring the place, but it didn't really make us feel any better. This wasn't ideal, and we had hoped to avoid other people. But since we were already there, it felt like a waste of time to just turn back. We turned on our flashlights and started walking into the dark section of the mall, moving the light around. All the stores were emptied out with garbage and graffiti everywhere. By then, the sun had fully set. When I looked back toward where we'd come from, it was pitch black there too. I turned around to tell Jake, but he had stopped walking and was holding his flashlight steady in front of him. "Jake," I whispered, but then I looked closer at where his light was pointing. Far back in the store, directly ahead of us, I saw a figure. They were standing by the entrance to the shop, just looking at us. What terrified us the most was how creepy it was for them to just stand there without saying hello or walking away or something. As more and more seconds passed, my heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest with terror before Jake finally moved his light away. Both of us turned around and started walking quickly back the way we had come. We were constantly swinging our flashlights around as we navigated through the darkness. our footsteps echoing around us and making it hard to hear anything else, only adding to the panic. Eventually, our lights hit the entrance to the mall, and just then we heard running footsteps coming from the floor above us. I shined my light up and caught a quick glimpse of a person running down the hallway. At that moment, Jake and I started sprinting, heading straight for the exit as we heard the footsteps coming down the escalators toward us. We managed to get outside and kept running through the parking lot and all the way to the trees. Looking back, no one had followed us out. As we walked back to the car, I almost threw up from my heart racing so fast. We got in the car and drove back to Jake's house, and after that, we never talked about it again. I don't know what that was. The way it all played out, though, I just can't see how a couple of people would plan all that without meaning harm. Thankfully, we didn't assume anything, because if we had stayed there and continued exploring, there's no telling what might have happened. There's an abandoned hotel in my town that's been vacant for decades. It had been bought out several times, but every time the owners ended up going bankrupt after just a few years. Our town is small and kind of old-fashioned, so there's really no reason for anyone to visit unless they have family here, which means there's no real reason for a hotel as big as this one to exist. It was at least 6 stories high and was probably the largest building in our town. When I was 23, I casually decided to check it out. I felt like there was nothing actually dangerous or scary about it. It was just an empty, abandoned building that would be cool to walk around and explore. I decided to go during the day, thinking that if anyone else was there, they'd probably be harmless, just people exploring like me. I parked at a store about half a mile away and walked to the hotel. It was mostly isolated on the side of the road, as most of the stores surrounding it had already been torn down. The hotel itself looked a lot worse than the last time I'd seen it. The bricks were crumbling, and the whole place seemed like it was fading and decaying. I walked up to the front and glanced inside. It was mostly empty, with only a few things scattered around like chairs and old furniture. I stepped in and walked through the lobby, opening the door to the staircase. The whole stairwell was covered in shadows as barely any light was coming in. I could see only a dim beam of light coming from one of the floors above, just enough to help me find my way up the stairs. When I got to the door on the second story, it was blocked. Something on the other side was keeping it from opening, and a sheet of wood covered the window on the door. I left it and continued up to the third story, where I opened the door and entered the hallway. This was probably the creepiest setting I'd ever been in. The hallway was dark and musty, with only a small window at either end to light up the corridor. I walked down a little bit and went into the first room with an open door. Oddly, it looked kind of normal. There were layers of dust covering everything, but all the furniture was set up as if it had never been moved. There were even towels and soap left in the bathroom. As I was looking around, I heard a small thump. I turned around and faced the doorway, unsure if the sound had come from the floor I was on or the one below me. A few seconds later, I heard quiet footsteps creeping along the floorboards in the hallway. As they got closer, I just stared at the doorway, hoping the person wasn't on my floor. After a few moments, the footsteps stopped, followed by a door opening and then slamming shut on the floor below me. After that, there were no footsteps or any sounds at all. I tried to stay quiet, walking up to the hallway and looking out to make sure no one else was around. Thinking about it, I couldn't understand why another person just exploring the place would walk so deliberately to a room and then slam the door. The more I thought about it, the more nervous I got, and the silence only added to the eeriness of the whole place. After a minute of standing in the hallway and thinking I'd had enough, I quietly walked back to the staircase, opened the door, and entered the dark stairwell to start descending. There was no way to be quiet on the metal stairs. Each step made an unavoidable hollow thump. But as I passed the door to the second story, I noticed a small gap in the doorway that definitely hadn't been there before. Then I looked down the stairs ahead of me. A figure stood in the stairwell only a few steps below, barely visible in the darkness, but their eyes stared right at me. They looked dreadful and emotionless. With no other choice, I started carefully walking on the edge of the staircase, passing by them with only a couple of feet between us. Their eyes followed my every move. Once I got to the bottom, I opened the door and ran out into the lobby, where I could finally see clearly. I hurried back to my car and sat in the parking lot for a while, catching my breath and processing what had just happened. Looking back, that was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever done. I guess I just didn't realize what I was walking into. I'm not sure why that person was there or what they were doing, but leaving when I did was probably the only good decision I made that day. In August 2016, a group of 4 teenagers ventured into an abandoned sauna in Tartu, Estonia. Built in 1915, when Estonia was part of the Russian Empire, the sauna served its community for 80 years until it was decommissioned in 1995. Left vacant for 23 years, the building was eventually renovated and transformed into a beauty salon in 2018, where it remains operational as of the video upload in 2023. When the teenagers entered the building, it was a stark, decaying relic of a place abandoned for over 2 decades. Mold covered the walls, the heaters were caked with rust, and holes in the floor added to the building's dangerous state. The eerie atmosphere was intensified by disturbing graffiti on the walls with unsettling phrases like "you can't hide" and stick figure drawings scattered across various rooms. For the first few minutes, the explorers found only remnants of previous visitors' loose shoes and other personal items. The teenagers continued to explore, but there was no sign of recent activity, and the place appeared to be entirely deserted. Then, about 20 minutes into their visit, they stumbled upon a doorway covered by a curtain. Curious, they decided to investigate. As one of them shined a flashlight into the dark room, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the shadows. Startled and terrified, the group dashed out of the building. By the time they reached their car, night had already fallen, and they fled the location without a second thought. Though they didn't capture the source of the scream, it was likely a homeless resident who hadn't expected any visitors. Despite going as a group, the experience was chilling, and none of the teenagers ever returned to the abandoned sauna. Robert Fulton Elementary School. An abandoned school in a rough Cleveland, Ohio neighborhood has stood vacant for over 13 years. Built 92 years ago, the once bustling school now sits empty, with its decaying structure becoming a target of local complaints. Residents have cited it as an eyesore, a potential crime hotspot, and a factor that lowers neighborhood property values. In response, the city announced a plan to turn the derelict school into a high-quality, mixed-income housing complex by the end of 2024, though funding challenges remain. Despite its condition, Robert Fulton Elementary has become one of the eeriest abandoned schools in the country, attracting urban explorers seeking a thrill. In May 2023, Christopher Hill from the YouTube channel Herc Hill returned to the school for a second exploration. He first visited in 2022 and documented the experience, where he heard strange humming, chanting, and banging noises echoing through the darkened rooms. During that visit, he warned viewers of the risks of exploring such places, as the building's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Despite the previous chilling experience, Chris decided to revisit Robert Fulton Elementary, this time alone, and at 1 a.m., the footage begins with Chris navigating the decaying corridors. The darkness, paired with the state of disrepair, gave the building an ominous atmosphere. Walls were peeling, floors were littered with debris, and the building's overall decay was startling, especially given that it had only been abandoned for a little over a decade. Moving cautiously, Chris captured footage of the deteriorated classrooms and hallways. He heard strange noises again, but nobody appeared to be around. The upper floors seemed particularly unstable, but Chris navigated them skillfully, avoiding areas where the floor creaked ominously beneath him. After 15 minutes on the upper floors, Chris ventured into the basement, the most damaged and disturbing part of the school. As he explored the basement, Chris noticed signs that someone else might be staying there. He also found what looked like a flooded boiler room. Around the 30-minute mark, a loud banging noise echoed from one of the rooms, and Chris quickly realized he was not alone. As he entered a classroom, he saw an unsettling message written on the chalkboard, "Don't explore alone." There was also a paper sign on the door that read, "Keep out." Despite these ominous warnings, Chris pressed forward and found additional signs of habitation. Suddenly, Chris heard a terrifying scream. Fearing for his life, he bolted out of the building. Upon reviewing the footage later, Chris noticed something even more disturbing in one scene. As he peeled back a curtain, the silhouette of a man was visible in the distance, walking into another room. Chris hadn't noticed this figure during his exploration, but it now seemed likely that someone had been watching him the entire time. Though the scream was terrifying, Chris realized that the basement room was likely someone's makeshift home, and from their perspective, it must have been equally unsettling to see a stranger enter. Encounters like this often turn violent, but fortunately, Chris made it out safely. Since this experience, he hasn't returned to Robert Fulton Elementary. In October 2019, YouTuber Baker X Derek, a tour guide from San Bernardino, California, stumbled upon an abandoned house sitting atop a hill while riding his motorcycle along the highway. Curious, he decided to explore it. From the start, it was clear that others had been inside, though they likely weren't the original owners. Unlike many abandoned buildings, this house retained hints of its former beauty, making it all the more eerie to explore, even in broad daylight. As Derek ventured inside, he found remnants of the house's past splendor mixed with unsettling details. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung in corners, and certain rooms exuded an eerie, unwelcoming aura. While exploring, Derek couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, particularly when he entered a dark room that seemed to exude an ominous vibe. At one point, he whispered to himself, feeling an unsettling sense that something or someone was lurking in the shadows. Derek then descended to the bottom floor, where he heard a sudden chilling thud. Terrified, he immediately made a dash for the exit, stumbling and nearly falling in his haste to get away. He eventually reached his motorcycle and left the location. Too many viewers of Derek's video speculated that the noise might have come from a homeless person living in the house, potentially warning him to stay away. Squatters often use noises to alert intruders, creating a natural deterrent without confrontation. This nonverbal warning is a tactic sometimes used to avoid violence. Although Derek had intended only to explore, it's likely the noise served as a first and final warning for him to leave. Thankfully, Derek respected the warning and managed to escape safely without further incident. In 2019, an urban explorer named John uploaded a video documenting his nighttime exploration of an abandoned mansion known as the Devil's Elbow. Located south of Port Elgin in Ontario, Canada, this eerie mansion sits in a small community called North Bruce, but is infamous for its dark history and creepy atmosphere. The mansion allegedly belonged to a high priest who performed occult rituals, leading locals to believe it was haunted and to avoid it entirely. Despite some sporadic renovations, the house remained empty at the time of John's exploration. When John entered, he noted that the mansion appeared to be in relatively decent condition compared to other abandoned buildings. However, the atmosphere quickly shifted as he began to hear strange noises from upstairs. Determined, he climbed the stairs, hoping it was merely paranormal activity rather than someone else lurking in the house. John called out to whoever or whatever might be making the noises, announcing that he was there only to explore and meant no harm. His only response was an eerie silence, punctuated by faint, unsettling sounds that soon started up again. As he walked further into the upper floors, the noises grew louder. Suddenly, a man's voice screamed, "I'm going to kill you." Terrified, John turned and bolted from the mansion without looking back. The fear was palpable in his video as he sprinted for safety, not daring to investigate further. Though John never discovered who was hiding in the house, many viewers speculated that it wasn't another urban explorer. Urban explorers typically respect one another and adhere to a code to help keep these dangerous places as safe as possible. Whoever screamed likely wasn't there for the thrill of exploration, but perhaps was a squatter or someone with malicious intent. Thanks to his quick escape, John avoided what could have been a dangerous encounter. The mystery of the Devil's Elbow Mansion remains, leaving viewers and locals wondering about the true nature of the house and its chilling past. My sister and I grew up together as two completely normal girls. She is 26 years old now, and I am 24, but for the last 10 years I've had to visit her every weekend in a mental health center where she's been confined. You might wonder why my sister ended up in such a place. And I wish I could give you a clear answer, but the truth is, what happened to her remains a complete mystery to this day. It all started with a strange incident that took place one summer afternoon in 2013, which changed our lives forever. At the time, Brianna was 16 years old, and I had just turned 14. Our father, an architect, was constantly traveling for work. Our mother had passed away from breast cancer when Brianna and I were little, so it was just us and Dad. Despite his busy schedule, Dad always took care of us and provided a good life. When Dad was assigned a project to redesign an old, abandoned house into a hotel, we had to move to a new city. The project would take several years, so we settled temporarily in a small house near the old one. From my sister's room, you could see the grand old mansion standing in decay. I noticed how huge and spectacular the old house must have been in its glory days, but now it gave off a creepy vibe. The house sat in a rural area surrounded by land and forest, and although I was initially excited to move to a bigger, modern city, we ended up in a small farming town on the outskirts of the metropolis. I missed my friends, and the quiet countryside bored me. The old, abandoned mansion, always looming in the background, filled me with unease. While Dad worked on the house during the day, Brianna and I went to a nearby school. My sister quickly made friends and became popular while I was more of a quiet girl blending into the background. Brianna's new social life, however, soon led to an event that would mark our lives forever. One day at school, I overheard two girls talking about a party my sister was planning at the old abandoned house. Confused, I confronted Brianna on our way home. She shrugged it off and begged me not to tell Dad, saying it was a chance to become more popular. Although I was worried, I reluctantly kept her secret. Dad left for a 3-day work trip, and despite his strict instructions not to leave the house after 7 p.m. or invite friends over, Brianna went ahead with her plan. The night of the party, I watched as she and her friends snuck into the mansion. Something in my gut told me this was a bad idea, but I didn't stop her. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by Brianna's scream. Rushing to the mansion, I found her unconscious, carried out by her friends. They said she had gone upstairs alone and started screaming. No one knew what had happened. When I saw her lying motionless, guilt washed over me for not stopping the party or telling Dad. The next morning, Brianna was different. She no longer talked or went out. She spent her days sitting by the window, staring at the old house. Then things took a darker turn. She started whispering incoherently, laughing to herself as if she was speaking to someone. Desperate, Dad called a psychiatrist, but during the session, Brianna attacked the doctor, biting a chunk of flesh from his neck while laughing maniacally. We were terrified. My once lively sister had become violent and unstable, and no one could explain why. I finally confessed to Dad about the party and the strange events that followed. He was furious, but before we could resolve anything, Brianna's behavior worsened. One night we heard strange noises from her room. When we opened the door, we found her eating a dead rat. That night, Brianna was taken away to a mental health center, bound tightly as if she were a wild animal. Despite numerous doctor visits, no one could diagnose her condition. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to her was connected to the house. I started researching the mansion and learned it once belonged to an old man who died there after being abandoned by his children. Locals told stories about his violent behavior and his descent into madness before his death. Despite my pleas, Dad refused to believe an exorcism would help Brianna. In frustration, he set fire to the mansion, a decision that cost him his job and left us broke. Now, I visit Brianna every weekend. She's no longer violent, but she rarely speaks and continues to stare out the window, lost in her own world. I am an extremely curious person. I can't help but want to know everything when something catches my interest. However, after this day, I understood the meaning of the old saying, curiosity killed the cat like never before. This story took place when I was in high school. One day I found out there was an old abandoned building within walking distance from my house. I had recently developed a peculiar interest in exploring abandoned places in the city, which had made me quite popular among my schoolmates. This passion for exploring ruins began after watching a video on YouTube, and it felt like a sudden epiphany, like discovering my true calling. It was as if in a single moment I knew I wanted to explore these places in my own city. By that point, I had already explored an abandoned school, a church, and several houses. But after hearing about this particular building, my curiosity to visit it grew with each passing day. I also felt that exploring this mansion would give me an amazing story to share with everyone, maybe even becoming their favorite. Fueled by this curiosity, I convinced my friends Liam, Charlie, and Elvis to join me. At first, Elvis didn't want to come, but after some convincing and nagging, he finally agreed. We told him it would be a wonderful experience and a story he'd remember for the rest of his life. We agreed to go the following day after school, as it would be quite a tiring walk. The building was deep in the thick forest surrounding the city. After nearly 2 hours of walking, we finally arrived, and as soon as we saw the mansion in front of us, we knew it was worth every step. The place was massive and imposing, a beautiful mansion from the 1920s, still impressive despite its dilapidated state. The immense walls were dirty and worn with cracks and trees growing through them. Most of the windows were broken, but we couldn't see much inside. After a few seconds of staring, we jumped through a window and landed inside next to the stairs, which, like the rest of the house, were dirty and in bad shape. Somehow, we managed to use them without any mishaps. We started by exploring the entire first floor, rummaging through the old furniture. Surprisingly, everything seemed to be in place intact, as though the house had just been abandoned. The furniture was still covered with sheets, although they were now old and moldy. In the dining room, all the chairs were in place around the glass and wooden table with a long dead flower arrangement in the center. The flowers had decayed into a dark, smelly mass at the bottom of the vase. We also found photos scattered around the house. Some were decorative, while others showed a family of father, mother, and 2 children. Unfortunately, the photos were so deteriorated that it was nearly impossible to make out their faces. Only their clothing and poses suggested they were family portraits. During my research before visiting the house, I discovered it once belonged to a mafioso who fled the country in the late 80s and died in exile. I found no information about his family, so I assumed they either fled with him or at some other time. Of all the rooms we explored, the kitchen particularly caught my attention. It looked like a small-time capsule, still stocked with utensils, pots, plates, and even supplies in the pantry. The canned food, of course, was rusty and long expired. Based on a label I found in decent condition, the house had been abandoned for at least 40 years, yet it remained strangely untouched. I had explored many buildings with similar abandonment dates, but in those cases there was always evidence of looting or vandalism. Here everything was in place, as though no one had ever ventured inside. It was unsettling. While in the kitchen, I started to feel like someone was watching me. I even thought I saw a silhouette in the corner. Turning quickly, I found nothing. The sensation of being observed stayed with me, though, so I left the kitchen to find the others who were exploring different parts of the living room. After thoroughly examining the first floor, we decided it was time to head upstairs to check out the bedrooms. The wooden stairs were in poor condition, so we climbed carefully, one at a time, to avoid them collapsing under our feet. When we reached the upstairs hallway, we immediately noticed two things: the area was in worse condition than the first floor, and the air smelled foul. Despite the odor, we pressed on, exploring the bedrooms. At one point, we stopped to examine a shelf with trophies in the hall. When we heard a loud noise behind us, we turned in unison, hearts racing, only to find Elvis laughing. He had slammed a door to scare us. Annoyed, we scolded him. The last thing we wanted was to draw attention to ourselves and get in trouble for trespassing. After a little altercation with Elvis, we entered the bedrooms. The foul odor turned out to be a dead animal, a decaying dog or wolf lying beside one of the beds in the third room. The smell was unbearable, so we quickly shut the door and moved on. The house was enormous, with 6 rooms upstairs, all facing each other along the corridor. Most rooms held little of interest, just beds and old, moth-eaten clothes. I was beginning to lose interest when something unexpected happened. We heard another loud noise coming from one of the rooms we had already explored. Elvis was with us, so we knew it wasn't him playing another prank. Seconds later, we heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by a door slamming shut. Fear gripped us. We cautiously left the room and headed toward the noise. Opening the door, we found a terrifying sight. On the back wall, written in red letters where the words "Get out of here" next to the writing, was the imprint of a small hand, as though a child had written the message with a finger dipped in blood. This writing definitely hadn't been there before. We were frozen in shock and fear. Without saying a word, we slowly backed out of the room. Once in the hallway, we debated whether to leave immediately or explore further. I wanted to keep exploring, but my friends were terrified and wanted to leave. I told them to wait downstairs while I quickly checked the last 2 rooms. Reluctantly, they agreed. Charlie and Liam headed downstairs while I continued toward the final rooms. My curiosity was stronger than my fear. I opened the door to one of the rooms, left it open, and began shining my flashlight around, taking pictures from the doorway. As I was doing this, I heard a faint sobbing sound coming from the corner, obscured by the bed. Despite my growing unease, I stepped further into the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I grabbed the handle, but it was sealed tight. The sobbing sound grew louder, turning into desperate wails. Then I heard a deep male voice full of anger, shouting insults, followed by cries of pain from the child. The room was empty, but the sounds were unmistakable. It was a terrifying scene of child abuse. Overwhelmed, I dropped to my knees, covering my ears to block out the horrifying sounds. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the room went silent. Shaken, I stood up, wiped my tears, and looked around. On the wall where I'd heard the sobbing was another blood-written message: "I told you to get out of here." Terror gripped me as I turned my gaze to the corner of the room. What I saw there will haunt me forever. Curled up in a fetal position was a small skeleton, draped in a moldy, tattered dress. It had been there for decades, judging by the dry bones and lack of any rotting smell. At that moment, I heard my friends banging on the door and calling my name. They had been trying to get in for a while, but I had been too distracted by the horror unfolding in the room. Finally, the door swung open and they rushed in, horrified by the sight of the small skeleton. That night, we called the police, who removed the remains. The blood writings on the walls had disappeared by the time they arrived. We later learned that the skeleton belonged to a 7-year-old girl named Amanda, who had been kidnapped 30 years earlier. Her killer was never found. Though the case remained unsolved, Amanda had shown me her suffering that day. It was an experience I never shared with anyone, as reliving it would be too much to bear. After that terrifying encounter, I never explored another abandoned building. At least Amanda's body was found and her family could finally lay her to rest.